happy to announce Doc Saunders, and we will be able to finish a little bit, hopefully 6:30 or 6:45. So we will not be too exhausted. But I mean, I'm sure his talk will all wake you up a little bit. He's a very inspiring person. He published this book, Arrival City, in 2012. It inspired me a lot. I'm using it in my teaching courses because it's all based on field research, on talking to people, talking to migrants settling in big cities. Where are the opportunities? Where are the troubles? And then based on that kind of informal research in informal ways, he came up with conclusions which I found compelling when it comes to the challenges of how can we reach UN SDGs, or ultimately it's all about urban expansion and a controlled urban expansion. And you illustrated that quite well with different examples, but I may be wrong. If I use the word urban expansion, you may use another term, but I think it will give us all a new perspective, a final new perspective on what the role of urbanization is. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And can you hear me, everybody? Very good. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everybody, for giving us so many great ideas to think about today. In a way, what I'm talking about hopefully will synthesize some of the things that you've been hearing in the last two panels. It might not be obvious that the way immigrants settle in cities is tied to sustainability, to ecological sustainability, and to economic sustainability of economies. But let me explain this. About 15 years ago, I published this book called Arrival City, where I had spent 4 years inside the immigrant districts of about 20 cities in Chongqing and Istanbul and Sao Paulo and et cetera, London, New York, and trying to understand the internal economic and social function of these districts. Because I realized that our economies and cultures are created in these immigrant districts. All of us, including us, white Europeans, owe our economic status and family origins to an immigrant district in our city. It was probably, in many cases, a rural to urban immigrant district. It may have been hundreds of years ago, but at the point when our families entered there, it was a distrusted part of the city. It was a difficult part of the city, and it had an internal economic function linking the originating village that your family came from to the city, very similar to the way that immigration districts in cities work now. And I'm going to make the point here that the way we manage these districts and the way we give them resources is central to the ecological sustainability of cities and of larger economies. But I'll get into the details. My unit of analysis, so I tried to generate what you'd call a general theory of the immigrant district, what makes some immigration districts become the new middle class of cities. There's a couple of immigrant neighborhoods of the 19th and 20th century in London and New York that were responsible for creating a huge proportion of the corporations of the UK and of the United States. Other immigration districts fall into intergenerational poverty and isolation in parallel societies and things like this. And then the next question is, what policies and interventions can turn the one fate into the other fate, and what has worked to do this? So my unit of analysis is the neighborhood level, or the district, or the quarter, or the Keats, or the favela, or whatever you want to call it. And I call this the Arrival City. So the misunderstood thing about the title of that book is I'm not referring to the city itself as the Arrival City, even if it's a city with a lot of immigrants. But hold on a second. But rather, it's the district within the city created by the immigrants, the city within the city. So Zurich, even though it's a city with a lot of immigrants, I would not call it an arrival city, but I would call, for example, the district of Seebach an arrival city. It's a place with its own economy and social structure created by the various immigrant communities who live there. And it probably has direct linkages to specific villages in Turkey, for example, and back and forth exchanges of knowledge and capital and people with those connecting places. And the people there are attempting to make investments to use the urban space around them to create a new economy, to create companies, to create employment, and so on. My understanding when I did this work was that we need to look at these districts as organic living units, as places where the newcomers are attempting to use the resources that are around them, the physical resources, the institutional resources, the resources of citizenship, the economic resources to create activity. So in a classic arrival city district like that photo I think is Handelsstraat in Antwerp. You'll find that the newcomers from Morocco or wherever are taking the house that they live in and saying, let's turn its ground floor into a restaurant or a small factory or something like that. And their success or failure depends on really whether the city lets them do that or not, and whether those resources are available, and whether the place they live has the connections. So if it's in a place like this where there are middle-class people walking around with money in their pockets, then your small business will likely make money. The little house you own will rise in value, and you will use that increase in value to pay for the education of your children, to pay for the creation of new businesses, and so on. This is how this accretion of value happens in the immigrant district. Now, developments during the 21st century have made this more complicated. I'm going to talk about this. This is not an advertisement for my book of 15 years ago. In a way, I'm saying it needs to be rethought. We need to move beyond this because of new spatial and social realities. And that's partly because I think we need to question the originating set of ideas behind this. And those come, as Philip mentioned, from my old neighbor, Jane Jacobs. Not a very well-known name in Europe necessarily, but she was the originator of sort of the fundamental idea of the city as an organic unit. So concepts such as Anne Hidalgo, the Paris mayor's concept of the 15-minute city. She credits Jane Jacobs as having originated that concept and so on. A lot of the ideas of neighborhoods being walkable and so on come from Jane. During the later period of her life in the 1990s, I had a lot of dialogues and interviews with her and so on that sort of was the root of my thinking about immigrant districts. She had her origins in New York City. She's sort of known as the lady who saved Greenwich Village. During the 1950s, New York wanted to demolish Greenwich Village and Little Italy and Chinatown and so on, and replace them with 12-lane expressways, because the dominant thinking during that time was that inner cities were a social problem and they were unhygienic, and people should drive out to the suburbs. Speaking of ecological sustainability and so on. And she led the protest movements against that and successfully saved Greenwich Village in existence. And then 15 years later, she did the same thing in Toronto, which is how I got to know her. She saved my neighborhood. But she didn't do this by being an activist or a protester. She did this by developing a theory of the urban neighborhood. That quote sort of summarizes it. She recognized that Neighborhoods work well when you remove constraints on the ability of the residents to do things within them. So if somebody wants to turn the ground floor of their house into a restaurant or a factory or nightclub or something like that, then the government should not constrain them from doing that. If they want to turn a house into a 20-unit apartment building, they should not be constrained. So usages and things like that should not be limited. And that was very important for the time. So in other words, she opposed turning neighborhoods into freeways, not sort of because she didn't like a type of politics, but because she did not believe planning and government should be involved in districts. And a lot of this sort of deep planning thinking has governed how we've understood how immigrant districts should work for economic success. If we can remove constraints to people doing things with the urban space around them, then economic success will flourish and so on. So her recipe book for a successful city, good mixtures of primary uses. So a successful neighborhood doesn't have residential over here and industrial over here and commercial over here. It has them all together in the same buildings. Close range mingling of buildings of different appearance and function. It looks funky. Different ages of buildings, high concentration of people. She was among the first to recognize that high population density equals successful communities and equals safe communities and equals ecologically sustainable communities. That low density is the sort of enemy of inclusion and sustainability. Eyes on the street was her big slogan. Every dwelling unit, she said, should open onto the street. And that's how crime goes down. If everybody lives out on the street, then then there's less crime and so on. And that's been a pretty fundamental planning formula since she formulated it the first time. Now, one of the problems that's arisen during the 21st century is that the cities of Europe and North America have been victims of the success of these ideas. Mayors and city authorities and regional authorities adopted Jane Jacobs type ideas to a hugely successful degree. And also, immigrants who were settling in the old industrial districts, in the old working class districts of cities, so successfully improved those districts by putting businesses there and putting activity there that middle-class white people and middle-class children and grandchildren of immigrants wanted to move there. So almost every city of Europe and North America now, the old low-rent immigrant and artist districts are now filled with people like me who are middle-class and so on. So new immigrants who are coming in can't really settle in those places. Sometimes they profit from this. In a lot of European cities, the Turkish immigrants bought the buildings in the center of the city and now profit as property developers and landlords and that sort of thing. So gentrification is often good for immigrants, at least for the immigrants who first settled. But the problem is where do newcomers then settle? And it tends to be places where the logic of Jane Jacobs, the logic that I talked about of removing constraints, doesn't really work so well. It tends to be places sometimes that look like this. The apartment suburbs are the big immigration settlement place in most cities now. I mean, I mentioned a district of Zurich that's in an apartment suburb on the outskirts. And these were usually built in the post-war decades as districts for factory workers, with the understanding that they would be driving a car to a factory and then to a different area of the city where there'd be employment, or where there'd be retail and employment and so on, with the understanding that these factory workers were units of labor, right? They weren't interested in becoming entrepreneurial or starting businesses, or if they did, they'd move out of these districts. The German architectural thinker Thomas Sieverts calls it these areas the Zwischenstadt. I'm very bad at pronouncing your language. The in-between city. I prefer the English translation of his book on this topic, which was called Cities Without Cities, by which he meant places that lack the resources of cities, that lack the retail spaces and the institutions and schools and things like that, and transit connections and things like that, but where people are still living. You sort of imagine a J.G. Ballard type space in between highway interchanges, or somewhere like this. These are popular places to live because the rent is cheap. And they're the only places you can move sometimes nowadays. But they have some fundamental problems that can't be addressed with the type of solutions that I talked about or that Jane Jacobs talked about during her life. Isn't that just a sec? An immigrant moves into a district like this. They can't do the sort of classic new immigrant thing, which they can't start a little shop or restaurant or something like that. Even if they have the money, there's no place in their building or facility to do that. And even if there is some physical space to do that, there aren't middle-class people walking around with money in their pocket to do that. There are not the transit connections because people starting out tend to not be able to afford a car. And we'll talk later about some other problems with these places. Like when you want to become middle class, you have to leave these districts. And also, these green spaces between the buildings look very nice on architectural renderings. If you look at the architectural renderings, they show little clusters of people standing around on the grass and talking to each other. But for new immigrants, particularly imagine if it's January, and particularly imagine if you're a woman living in this apartment and it's 10 o'clock at night in January, and you see only people you see down there are maybe some sketchy gangs of young guys with a dog or something like that doing who knows what. It impedes you from going and mixing with the other people in the district and culturally mixing with other people and integrating, really. It's a particularly gendered form of isolation that hurts. So I did a study with the Bosch Stiftung a few years ago where I looked at the immigration settlement districts in Europe, and I did particular studies in apartment districts outside of Leipzig, outside of Gothenburg, and outside of Barcelona. And the constraints to inclusion that were built into these places. So I did what I've done with the old inner city districts, and I asked people living there, what is in the way of you living your dream of becoming as successful and included as you want to? Because one thing I've found in a lot of my work is that if you ask the people living in these districts what is standing in the way, what is an obstacle to their economic and social success, they will identify it very specifically. And often it'll be a simpler problem than government agencies think there is, right? I mean, I did some work with one area in Morocco where government agencies were saying women are not entering the workforce. We need major workforce inclusion programs. We need to invest a lot of money. And then when I did fieldwork interviews, they said, well, the problem is that the place where you go to get work, it's just across the canal, but you need to walk up the canal a kilometer and for the only footbridge. And then after dark, there's sketchy guys on this footbridge, and it tends to be after dark hours when we can go there. And we realized that we could increase the workforce participation rate of women by having them build a bridge and install some street lighting. Rather than intergenerational expenses, often simple interventions are the solutions to these things. But this is where these new settlement districts of the 21st century, and look, it's It's only during this century that these spaces became immigration settlement spaces. In all three of these cities, and in many other European cities, and Houston and many other places, the apartment districts and the suburbs were working class, so-called white districts, until about 2003 or 2004. Those were the magic years when the whole map of cities flipped, when the working class inner city neighborhoods became middle class districts, and when the apartment suburbs became immigration settlement districts. It was the opposite in the 1990s in most places, and then suddenly it flipped. So city governments did not know how to understand these new populations, and often saw them as social problems, saw their economic stasis and lack of intergenerational socioeconomic mobility as an intrinsic problem of their culture, rather than a problem of their spatial environment and the economic resources that were around them. So when I interviewed the people living in places like this, the things that most often come up when I say, why is your district a trap, among those who see it as a place that traps them, they would often identify the same things: transit, isolation from the main urban economy. These apartment districts, those three apartment districts, all had the highest rates of COVID in the year 2020 of their larger city and sometimes of their entire region. Why? Because there was the immigrants living in these districts who had the so-called frontline jobs, where you couldn't work from home, but they were taking crowded trams and buses back and forth to work. So they were reliant on difficult forms of transit, physical isolation from surrounding communities, as I mentioned, paucity of essential services. You need to drive to another district for things that you need, and if you don't have a car, it's difficult. Absence of places for commerce and entrepreneurship. Like I said, you want to start a small business, you can't do it in your own community. Full of void spaces and insecure areas, as I mentioned. It's isolating. Lack of places to become middle class. This falls into another area that's very important for us to consider here, is that when people experience socioeconomic mobility, can they do it within their own community? Or do they have to move to an existing middle class district, which creates problems? It means the left behind people are left in this district. And you get this downward spiral of schools. I'll explain this a bit. The downward spiral of the district itself. Like I said, the flight of the ambitious people, which creates a psychological perception that this is a place for the people who are left behind. I call this the neighborhood mobility spiral. And you see this particularly in schools in these districts, where new immigrants and teachers move into the low-income neighborhood, into the school, but you quickly realize that the parents, the Moroccan or Turkish parents or the whatever, who are a little more aspirational, who have a little more social capital, they realize I should get my money from my job and get a cheap car and drive my kids to a school in a middle-class district every morning. Because they have better chances in these schools and they have better influences from the students around them in these schools. And then you end up left behind the children from families that have less social capital, less connection, and so on. The teachers perceive this as being a tough school to teach at because of this phenomenon. So the teachers themselves get transferred to the middle-class school in some other district. And then that creates the perception that the school has bad teachers as well, which means that it just becomes a downward spiral of schools. And the intervention that works, and I've seen this work successfully in Amsterdam and London and a number of other cities, is not just to try to level up the schools and other institutions to the average level of the city. You have to create a school that's so good in that district, that's so much better than the ones in the wealthy districts, that upper middle class parents want to send their kids to the poor immigrant district to go to school in that district. So you create a high quality magnet school. It requires those sorts of interventions. I developed, and I use this from my work in North Africa with the IOM and so on, but also in a lot of places, a grid. This is a very simplified version of the types of interventions that are needed to remove these obstacles identified by people. And I'm not going to get into all the details of them, but it's not just physical things. It's provision of institutions, it's the provision of transit ties, it's provision of business opportunities and economic things, the ability to have access to banking and services, the ability to start a legal company. Germany had big problems until this century because the 2 million people who'd come as Gastarbeiter workers in the 1960s and 70s and who were still residents of Germany could not legally start a company. So they either took their money back to Turkey and started companies there, or they just fell out of the economic system. So the guy who invented the modern doner kebab shop with the first restaurant in Bahnhof Zoo in early 1970s, he was unable to incorporate it because he was a former Gastarbeiter, and he was unable to buy a house or get into normal banking, and he died in poverty and so on. He could have been the Ray Kroc of Europe. There's more doner kebab shops than there are McDonald's. Ray Kroc was the guy who created McDonald's and so on. But instead, because of this lack of access to economic resources, he's a forgotten guy and nobody knows his name. And of course, political connections, the ability to govern your own community and so on. And sustainability, for a lot of my work, I now have an extra column on sustainability because as you can see, these type of districts on the outskirts are very ecologically unsustainable. It's a bit of a paradox because you look at these big apartment towers and you think, oh, that must be a high population density. But in fact, a lot of these districts have a low population density because of all these empty spaces between the buildings and these sort of things. And also, one thing we know is that cities become much more ecologically efficient when they have a tighter population density. And analyses of this, there's a great physicist, I'm forgetting his name, who did a great analysis of the ecological efficiency of cities. And he found there's a threshold point where you reach a certain density level where each additional person in the population reduces the per capita carbon output of the city. And that's predominantly by reducing private motor vehicle trips, because if people are living that close together, more and more things you can do just by walking to them. So you're eliminating trips, but also you're living in forms of housing that are easier to heat, like a building with 50 apartments in it. You can much more ecologically heat than a single family wooden house or something like that. A whole number of factors. Public transit. Electric public transit works much better when people are closer together. Those apartment districts were built for the car. So in the 20th century, the problem of the ecological unsustainability of cities was a matter of white middle-class people creating urban sprawl and eating up farmland and moving into the suburbs in ecologically unsustainable communities. In the 21st century, it's the problem of immigration settlement creating sprawl or exacerbating sprawl. Luckily, we have a lot of good examples of interventions to change these places. You can fill in the empty spaces. There are good programs in places like Toronto and Barcelona and Amsterdam to take those void spaces between buildings and fill them with industrial and commercial spaces and more housing and those sorts of things and make them much more thriving neighborhoods. And I've seen urban immigration districts turn around completely just by filling in those spaces, by creating a souk between the buildings rather than a place where teenage guys with dogs hang out and that sort of thing. The creation of connections, entrepreneurship, the things we've discussed. More secure and flexible housing tenure. Zurich's a funny place to be discussing this because usually it's a matter between rental places and ownership places. Generally, immigrant inclusion and integration and the immigrants becoming job creators and entrepreneurs works better in places where there's ownership, where immigrants like to own housing. Although provision of rental housing is useful, it tends to be difficult because the fundamental capital of owning your residence is often the main source of family capital for new immigrants. Zurich is a funny place to discuss this because cooperative housing and sort of hybrid tenure forms are so much more popular here, which are quite a good way to do this, actually. It's very hard to reproduce in other places. Better schools, capable of retaining students. There's a perpetual problem of the male children of immigrants. In the German type of secondary school system, which is used Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Belgium, and so on, it contains a whole lot of built-in incentives for young men if they're falling behind to leave school at age 16 or something like that. There's only one teacher per class. If you fail, one year, you're kept behind for that year. There's streaming into vocational or university at a very young age. All of these things create incentives to not continue your education. Interventions to fix that can solve a lot of the social problems and create a lot of economic activity. Some places, the best policies are ones actually encouraging people to move out of these districts and resettle them somewhere else. But other places, it's incentives for people to move in and so on. If in between those apartment buildings, you create some nice condominium apartments that middle-class people like to buy, then the poor immigrants from the apartments, when they start to make a little money with their business, they'll buy one of those apartments in their own district and so on. And plus there will be middle-class people from other parts of the city who will move in there, and there'll be examples and there'll be mentors and there'll be sources of social capital and that sort of thing. The successful mix in Amsterdam interventions is, I think it should be 60% expensive owned housing apartments and 40% rental or social housing. That's a good mix for creating social mobility and that sort of thing. So in summary, and I don't know if I've wrapped up all of the things that we've heard in the last two panels, I could talk forever about rural to urban migration as well. And I could give a whole other talk about my work on climate migration. I've spent a month each in Vietnam and in Bangladesh to show that climate crises reduce migration, that international migration. The problem of climate change is that it makes people unable to immigrate. And Europe should be prepared for the problem of the climate crisis, that it will not be flooded with climate migrants, but that it will be more difficult to get the immigrants that it needs. So it's almost like we should have a visa category of climate migrants because because people lose their agricultural livelihoods in climate disasters, they're unable to migrate internationally. Internally, yes, tons. And we've created that. That's a whole other topic, though, that was addressed. But if there's one takeaway from this, it's that we should think about the economic futures of our communities, about the ecological sustainability of our communities, and about the social cohesion and political cohesion of our communities in terms of the neighborhood scale and the interventions we can make to make the newcomer neighborhoods succeed in the places around us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was, in a way, a little bit unexpected. I also expect the idea of urban expansion, when you are arguing that when you are in the outskirts, everything would sort of degrade in a way because it's less population density, less shops and so on. But my experience, when just thinking of Ethiopia, where Addis Ababa is expanding rapidly. They built satellite cities all around. And then ETH architects came when we were there in 2010 saying, that's a disaster. Badly built houses in the outskirts, somewhere not connected to the tram, not connected to the roads. And my mother-in-law even had an apartment out in the south there. And we could really observe how things change every year. At the beginning, there were 3 or 4 apartment buildings, 400 families completely isolated. But then the last time we visited them, it was a city of 50,000 people, shopping streets, parks, and of course, tram access, roads. So isn't it also this kind of misconception that these are passive victims who are now taken out of the ecosystem and now they're lost somewhere outside? I mean, my experience is they create vibrant places outside. I mean,
but if they're allowed to transform their physical space. In the outskirts of Addis, they could, the people living there, who I bet a lot of them were people who'd moved in from the villages,
they moved from the center. That was the argument.
They moved from the center, yes.
They said they were forced. No, in fact, there's a housing lottery. 1 million apply every year to go out there.
Yeah.
So there must be something attractive.
Yeah, but they could create the businesses and shops and these sorts of things.
Yeah. That's where I agree.
The problem with these apartment districts in European cities and in North American cities is that it's very, very hard to do that. In fact, in Toronto, where I live, there's a group of architects who actually got the city to pass a law allowing those apartment districts like the one I showed, allowing the owners of the buildings, of the rental buildings, to build new structures in between for new housing and shops and those sorts of things. But most of these buildings were owned by old ladies who were like widows of people who'd built them. And who they liked to just receive the checks from the property management company that collected the rent every month. And they did not like to risk their capital on expansion and that sort of thing. So they saw safe money as better than more money. And so this is the problem. If the immigrants themselves controlled the district, then yes, they'd be setting up their businesses in there. So it's partly who controls.
Yeah, and with regard to densification, I mean, the city of Lagos has a density 10 times higher than the density of Paris, and but they don't want. That's the problem. I mean, if we would tell them to further densify, they would say, "Are you crazy?" Because it's all these informal settlements, right?
Well, we tend to think of density when we tend to think of Lagos when we say high density city, but the highest density place in the UK is Kensington and Chelsea. Yeah. The highest density place in France is the 7th arrondissement, right?
But it's still much less dense than Lagos. I mean, that's the thing. When you compare the maps.
Not as much as you may think, because Lagos is not so high-rise. And Lagos is just bad because it has bad transit connections and that sort of thing. Population density is not the problem in Lagos.
Well, I mean, we had this other workshop, me and Mark Schäfer, on urban expansion with Shlomo Angel. Do you know him? Mm-hmm. I mean, who said this Lagos is in fact failing the people because they settle illegally outside and then they have to go to work in the formal area.
Yeah, I would say
to a labyrinth.
I would say Lagos's problem is not population density; it's urban sprawl. It's like an American city in the 1950s, in that it keeps sprawling outward, eating up agricultural land, and it makes itself more and more impossible to have a public transit solution to its mobility problems. This is same as true in Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is a problem this way in that you can't get around. Mm-hmm. You try to do one thing in the day. Tehran has this problem as well. Impossible to get around. It's not really a matter of density. It's a matter of connection.
All these arterial roads take a lot of space. So if you take that into account, then there is more space per capita than if you don't have them, right? That's a little bit the idea. And then the final point is, I mean, when it comes to gentrification, is it really a new phenomenon? I remember in Zurich, where the Bahnhofstrasse is, that used to be the poorest area in the 19th century. It was erased. and must have been exactly the same debate we probably have now. And so, what is different compared to earlier periods of gentrification where people had to move out?
It's the same thing. And now, I've lived for a large part of my life in London, which is a special problem because a lot of the property in London is not subject to gentrification from within, but subject to portfolio investment, because everybody in any messed up country around the world knows that if you don't trust the stock exchange in your country and you don't trust the banks in your country, you put your money into London real estate. That is unique to London. Even New York doesn't really have this problem because people tend to live in the buildings and that sort of thing. But if you look back 150, 200 years, London districts, the new arrival city districts in London, which were built around the train stations, they were very distrusted and they were seen as places of social failure. They were mostly internal immigrants from Wales and from Northern England and that sort of thing. And they were seen as places of crime, places of misery, insalubrious places, as they would say. But, then they went, one district in East London gave us both Marks and Spencer and Tesco as its local creations and that sort of thing. So a lot of it's timeless. And with gentrification, you just have to recognize that you have to create an instrument for participation in the gentrification. Certainly the immigrant districts around me, my neighborhood is full of was settled by poor Portuguese people and Eastern European Jews in different groups. And their children moved out to the suburbs, and then their grandchildren moved back into the neighborhood where I live because it became a desirable middle-class neighborhood with interesting Portuguese and Jewish culture and that sort of thing. So my wife is Italian. She has followed her family out of the city and then back into the district where they arrived in the 1920s and so on. So participating in the gentrification. Generally, it's beneficial to immigrants if they have some form of housing tenure. Doesn't have to be outright ownership. But you look at what happened with African Americans who migrated to Chicago and New York and so on after the end of slavery. They did very well, formed a middle class at first because they bought housing at a much higher rate than anyone else. But then the governments and insurance systems of the United States cut them off from the ability to buy insurance on their housing and so on. And that was when the ghettos started to form and that sort of thing, because they were denied access to the housing ownership.
Exactly, it's the economic rights. Mm-hmm. Marcus?
Yeah, so thanks for your lecture. I think it resonates a lot with us. I mean, as urbanists, of course, and architects. So I understand very perfectly what you're talking about. So also in Switzerland, this idea of urbanizing the agglomeration, as we call it, so our Zwischenstadt or the suburbs, is a huge issue. Now, do you know of any strategies, policies, or models of doing this at scale? Because I think it is a particular issue. You mentioned kind of building in between these large blocks. In Switzerland, the issue is very much incentivizing densification, by public transport on the one hand, by changing local planning law that you have more density which you can exploit, therefore no investment comes in. But is there, in your experience, a kind of models for doing this at scale?
It depends what scale you mean. Part of the problem is that it's best done on a neighborhood by neighborhood level. I actually think Zurich has some of the best policies for these things. Zurich is an unusual city in that it has both one of the biggest housing affordability crises of any European city. It has among the most expensive housing, and it also has some of the highest levels of immigration settlement. People think this is a paradox, I will often argue the best place for an immigrant to settle is somewhere they cannot afford to live. Because whatever makes the housing expensive and unaffordable is what makes it a place where you're going to make money and where you can, if you start a business, you're going to get customers and things like that. I did advising work for the Frankfurt region, Rhine-Main region during the 2015-16 migration crisis. On refugee housing, and I kept saying to them and to other governments, please do not settle people in places where the housing is affordable. They ended up doing that. They put a large number of migrants in cities of the former DDR, like Cottbus and places like that, or in abandoned US military bases and things like that, and where they couldn't connect with the economy or things like that. Now, you're talking about solutions at scale. I forgive them for that because it was a lot of people. and really, you know, I mean, they had to do something, so on. Examples at scale, at larger scales that work. The favorite example that I come back to quite a bit and that I mention in its early days in this book is in the western parts of Amsterdam, the Newberry's. No, sorry, that's in Barcelona. Anyway, the very large apartment immigration districts of Western Amsterdam. What's that? Yeah, and over Tomseveld and places with names like that, and there was a very, very large scale intervention to fill in the spaces between buildings this way and to create middle class housing in the apartments and so on. And these have become kind of funky neighborhoods. I mean, Greenpeace has its world headquarters in the middle of these districts and things like that. But it was partly this idea. What was interesting was they said the new buildings have to have 60% middle-class apartments for purchase. And like I said, 40% the world. And this was done at a very large scale. They imagined that it would be middle-class Dutch people who would move into these neighborhoods and buy the apartments. And therefore setting examples and making them artistic places and things like that, and so on. And they were shocked by the percentage of Moroccans who had made a little money running a restaurant or something like that, who decided to buy these flats so that they could become middle class within their own district and so on. It's a very nice example. It's not a utopia, nothing's perfect, but it's a nice example of creating opportunities for socioeconomic mobility within the district. It's also a nice part of Amsterdam now to sort of walk. It's a lot of the interventions were architecturally very pleasant as well. They don't all have to be ugly buildings, you know, and you can make ugly and really I think ugliness of a neighborhood sometimes is the problem, but you have to get away from the European sense of what is a nice looking neighborhood, which European architects will say if every house front is the same as every other, that's a nice looking neighborhood. Whereas I like this street that I live on, which in 1880 was identical Victorian houses, and then all the immigrants moved in. Each of them put different cladding on the front. Each of them put different additions on the front and different things like that. So now each house looks completely different from the other. Some of them, and it looks like cacophony. It looks like chaos to the eyes of a European architect. But it also looks like, you know, interesting, stimulating urban variety to the eyes. So to allow people to build a little bit of chaos, to have a souk between the apartment buildings, often then you start getting tourists who want to visit that place. I showed you that picture at the very beginning of Handelsstraat in Antwerp. For decades, including 2010s, the city governments of Antwerp actually redirected the streets and the signs to make sure that no tourist accidentally walked onto Handelsstraat, right? Because it's right beside the Diamond District, and it's the Moroccan district where all the restaurants are. Meanwhile, every Moroccan from 3 countries away was visiting on weekends to Handelsstraat because it was where all the good food was and all the good shops and so on. And only very recently did they realize, oh, actually, if we put up signs saying, visit our funky Moroccan eating district, people will take the train to Antwerp to visit this place, and it's successful now that way. You see it in the way Brick Lane was the same way in London. You know, for years they said this is a bad place, stay away, and now half of the American tourists want to go to Brick Lane. You know,
very interesting. So I'm not sure if are there other. Yeah, there are. There, yeah, there's one. And please try to be brief with the answer. So
I realize we all want to go to dinner. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I come from another perspective right now. I'm Albanian with origin, and basically we had no rules in Albania in construction or everything. So
sorry, where?
Albania.
Oh yes.
Yeah. And when you're coming and saying like we need to remove these constraints, I'm feeling a little bit reluctant because when we are now, if I go back to my country, we are always looking into Europe and saying like, hey, now we have apartments built one on top of the other. We have no ways for the fire works to go inside and all these kind of things. Where do you think is the limit on the constraints or no constraints aspects of this?
In a city like Tirana, sometimes that chaos and danger has its benefits, but sometimes it constrains. I mean, like when people make a little bit of money, they don't just want to leave the district; they want to leave the country because of these things, which is maybe why you're here. But there's a tough line because sometimes laws designed to prevent danger and ugliness can really constrain things. There was a real problem in Nairobi with attempts by housing companies to create apartments for poor people to move out of the slums and into apartments. And their law had minimum standards for size and health of housing. It had to be a certain number of square meters. It had to have a certain number of windows. And the problem with that was that nobody from a slum could afford that minimum standard of housing. So the only people who lived in it were people who rented these flats and then put internal walls in and turned them into 5 flats inside. It was the minimum healthy standard for an apartment, but for slum dweller, it could only be affordable if it was 5 apartments inside that same space. And I've spent a lot of time trying to convince cities to tell their health departments to be less strict. And people say, oh no, we don't want that. We don't want immigrant restaurants to have rats in the food or something like that. That's not the problem. The problem is if an immigrant wants to open a little thing making some nice food on the street like that, in a lot of cities in Europe, just to do that minimum little food thing, they have to install a ventilation system that costs 40,000 euro. And so on. That's the type of health regulations that are the problem. So, okay, Tirana may be in an extreme case. Let's say has to be a space between Tirana, where it's purely laissez-faire, and maybe you don't want to live in an apartment building because it's going to fall down on you, and Tirana and Toronto, where I live, where the regulations are so strict that nobody can sell any food on the street. Because it requires $100,000 investment and that sort of thing. There's a middle ground, but the point is that it shouldn't be the authorities who are top-down saying these things. It should be the people who are living in the district who have the ability to change it.
Very good. So we had different perspectives. Thanks a lot.